Well, today we're talking about equality before the law and a lot of interesting history and background that brings us to 2024. And so, on that note, I want to welcome our next guest, Senior Fellow Brian Giesbrecht. And Brian is a well-known columnist. He's quite an analyst, and he's also a former judge. So, a warm welcome to you, Brian.
Well, nice to be here, David.
I want to lead off with a question, and it relates to the vision of our country. I recall reading a number of years ago Richard Gwynn's, I think, an amazing book. I certainly recommend it to people. It talks about a nation maker, namely about Sir John A. Macdonald and his incredible leadership and legacy as our first prime minister. But he basically talks about when Sir John A. Macdonald worked so hard, well, with so many others, to found this country. Richard Gwynn says that part of the vision for our country, an essential first principle, was that we would be creating a new nationality that would be political rather than ethnic, and it would be composed of values, attitudes, rather than race. Would you agree that that's the essential first principle of the founding of our country?
Yeah, I think he has it exactly right. And that's exactly what John A. Macdonald and our founders wanted. They saw what was happening in Europe. They looked to the South, and after all, the Civil War, with all of its carnage, had just recently ended. And that's not what they wanted. They wanted a country of equals. Reserves were created, the Indian Act was created, and the treaties were even signed with the idea that Indians would assimilate or integrate into the Canadian whole. Mm-hmm. And for various historical reasons, that didn't happen. We still have Indian reserves. We still have the truly racist Indian Act with us. Mm-hmm. And yes, Richard Gwynn had it exactly right, and that's the Canada I believe that most Canadians want.
So the whole narrative then, because we often hear this, certainly it's taught regularly by historians and universities, that Canada is a genocidal nation, that it was founded on genocide, and that we're all white settlers, so that somehow we are truly. This is all about oppression. And is it really that simple? Is it that black and white? Or like it sounds like there's a story here that people were trying to work together to create a nation and trying to work together to do that. But was it really genocidal?
No, it wasn't genocide at all. There's no denying that there was racism and there were bad policies, mm-hmm. and there were bad people.
Indeed.
But generally, the intention all along was to have Indians integrate, assimilate. Now, assimilate is now treated as a bad word, as if it was forcing people to do something they didn't want to do. But let me just give you an example, David. I recently wrote an article about Wab Kinew, and just use him as an example of an assimilated Canadian. Now, that's the kind of person John A. Macdonald wanted to create, a fully assimilated Indian person who was perfectly at liberty to celebrate his Indigenous heritage and culture in any way that he wanted. So it's obviously true that Canada is a country that can work for Indigenous people. Wab Kinew is just one example of many less famous people who have entered the mainstream.
So we should be, celebrating the fact that we have so many great fellow Canadians, Wab Kinew included, who are thriving and succeeding and making a difference in our nation. So Brian, just to pick up then the threads of history here, then there was an effort then by our government to establish a set of practices that would actually enable First Nations people, Aboriginals, to succeed. And so can you help us understand this complex set of agreements and entitlements? We had the reserve system, of course. What are the kind of, can you help us understand the examples of how we work with Aboriginal peoples to help support them?
Well, I mentioned that, in my opinion, well-meaning politicians and well-meaning judges have made the situation a lot worse by basically cementing in place the reserve system. Uh, an
Mm.
example would be the income tax exemption. Now, as we know, status Indians don't have to pay income tax on income that they earn on the reserve, and that can be extended in various ways, even to people who work in the cities, etc. So, where did that come from? It comes from one Supreme Court case, one of the most poorly argued Supreme Court cases in our history, where the court just said, okay, well, we'll take a obscure section from the Indian Act that prevents property from being seized on the reserve, and we'll say that that applies to income tax. And so
Mm.
they literally invented this, thinking they were doing something good, something they were helping Indian people, but
Hmm.
they weren't at all. All this does is create a different set of incentives to keep the reserve system in place. And that's just one of many, many examples of what our well-meaning politicians and judges have done now for many years. They should have been doing the opposite. The they should have been incentivizing Indigenous people from uneconomic communities to move to
Mm.
places where there are jobs and opportunities. They should be helping people make those decisions and helping them move successfully to job centers. But that's not what has happened. Instead, we have the worst of both worlds. We have these uneconomic reserves, and at the same time, we have the Indigenous people who do leave those people, move to cities, and they're
Mhm.
just not prepared. The reserve life has just not prepared them to succeed.
The situation is complex and it continues to evolve. Where some decades ago, there's been a whole new set of changes made to different agreements in the form of also land claims. And the whole idea is that those land claims, those have they generally made a positive difference then in the future and how we work together to build a prosperous future for First Nations peoples?
Well, in my opinion, generally no. The litigation business, the sort of alliance between the chiefs and the legal profession, in my opinion, has not helped Indian people integrate into Canadian society at all. It's done the exact
Hmm.
opposite. You have some people being enormously enriched, but the large underclass of Indigenous people remain marginalized. The whole thrust of our policy should be to try to uh, move that underclass up the ladder, up the socioeconomic ladder. And that has not happened. What we're getting is huge amounts of money are going back and forth. But that large Indigenous underclass is remaining stagnant. So, in my opinion,
Wow.
what policies have been pursued, and especially the giveaway programs with all of this money, have actually made the situation a lot worse than it otherwise would have
Okay.
been.
So this is fascinating. This is you're really challenging us to look at this and say, if I'm hearing you correctly, these types of agreements where you have significant resources and money being decided upon, who are they really serving? Are they serving kind of an elite, or are they serving the people that are involved in this? Is that what you're getting at, Brian?
Yes, it is. I can see what Canada is becoming, and you live in BC, and you're paying attention to this Haida agreement. So what we are becoming is in some ways like, say, uh, Saudi Arabia, where you might have a number of exceedingly rich princes
Mm-hmm.
and surrounded by a lot of underclass, very, very poor people. And I'm afraid that's what we're starting to look like, where some people are benefiting enormously from this this money transfer. And as Canada is morphs into this nation that is supposedly includes hundreds of these little tiny nations, and you will
That's
have
fascinating.
some people who are very wealthy, and you will even have different laws on the reserve. The Supreme Court has recently said that the Charter of Rights doesn't even apply in certain cases on reserves. So you're going to get, yes, and nations, these sort of semi independent nations, like I use the Hyde Agreement as an example. And this is not the Canada that we were supposed to have. And I think Canadians are starting to wake up to the fact that something's wrong here. Our Supreme Court and our current government is pushing us in a direction we shouldn't be going to, because it's going to be a very different Canada if all of these efforts to reinstall tribalism, and that's really what it is, if they are successful.
Okay, so just to recap here a little bit, we have a founding of a nation. We referenced Sir John A. Macdonald, where we have a nationality based on common set of values and attitudes and a common set of rights and freedoms. But it sounds like there's been a kind of almost an unintentional evolution now of a kind of a separation going on. And, it's interesting. More recently, the last few decades, we've heard the phrase, and we've heard this from Indigenous elites and some non-Indigenous elites who say that our system of reserves and entitlements that we just talked about are really based on the principle separate but equal. What does that mean, Brian, in your view?
Unfortunately, it means separate. Never mind the equal part. It means separate. And let me just talk about that history, because you referred to it. We had a country that believed in integration of the Indians, and we had a very firmly believed that Indians should take their place as ordinary Canadians. Now, there were complaints, very legitimate complaints from the chiefs early on, that racism and other factors were preventing them from achieving their potential. As a matter of fact, they petitioned Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and said, we are living in ghettos here. These reserves are ghettos, and we want out. And what Trudeau and his Indian Affairs Minister, Jean Chrétien, did, their response was a white paper which would have eliminated over time the Indian Act. It would have eliminated the reserve system. But then the chiefs decided, no, they didn't want to lose the perks that they had, and one of those being, for instance, the income tax exemption. So they organized themselves, and it's now seen as a heroic effort. It wasn't a heroic effort. It was a wasted opportunity. Instead of taking that white paper opportunity as a way of getting out of the reserve system and moving in a different direction, they insisted that the Indian Act remain in place and the reserve system remain in place.
Isn't that interesting? So part of what's fascinating about this discussion then is we've seen over many, many years an evolution of a founding vision, where that vision was clearly about integration and trying to move things forward in terms of prosperity. And you're saying that was a good vision then from your perspective. Is that right, Brian?
Absolutely. And I'm not denying that there were many issues there, and racism was definitely still a factor in 1969. But when the Supreme Court, instead of going on the path towards integration, respectful integration, the court embarked on this nation-to-nation expansion program. They said, and they're even saying now, that reconciliation means recognizing nation to nation. So I know I'm saying something that will offend some people, and I apologize. But I think that the Supreme Court set us on the wrong path, and it's led to
Okay.
this awful period that BC is now going to be going through, probably for many years.
Okay.
Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.